So hi, I'm Kat. My pronouns are she, her. I'm currently finishing up my MA in philosophy at University College Dublin. So I feel like I have a little bit of a different background maybe than a lot of the people here who come from a kind of social science or visual cultures perspective, for example. But yeah, let's see how it goes. So this talk has evolved quite a lot, or given me a headache if you want. So it might be a little bit different from the proposal I've submitted. But I think it ties up actually many threads of the conference today, which I found really exciting. And I'm not going to draw out all of them because I don't have time, but I hope that maybe you guys can make some of those connections. So my talk today is entitled Making Space for Queer Joy, which I think is a bit of an ambiguous title in some ways, and that was intentional. I mean, first of all, it's kind of a call to action. It's a call for us to make space for queer joy. It's also a kind of a statement. I'm trying to make space for queer joy at this conference by having this talk, I guess. And I'm also thinking about connections between queer joy and queer space. So yeah, that's basically that. As a bit of a caveat before we get started, this is a super Western-centric talk. As we've seen in this conference, for example, in Nastasia Brambaran's presentation on queer in the Caribbean, queer is not the same everywhere, and queer joy will not be configured the same everywhere, and that's just a good thing to keep in mind. And I'm sure that a lot of what I'm saying here actually doesn't translate across cultures because of these reasons. But yeah, so a quick outline of my talk is, so the title implies that joy is kind of absent in some way from queer space. And so I'm going to start out by kind of giving an overview of a negativity that we discuss in queerness in three ways. So queer as deviance, secondly, queer as kind of having no future, and thirdly, queer or kind of the negative affect that circulates in queerness. I'm mainly going to address the first and the third premise. I'm not going to spend any time on thinking about no future and kind of ailments approach because I ran out of space. And I'm going to do this by looking towards phenomenology to think about queer as something that is embodied, intercorporeal, and relational, something that I think happens necessarily with and between queer people. And finally, I'm going to make some suggestions about how joy features and where it's found. So, as many here, when I'm starting to speak about queer, I first think about what does it actually mean to talk about queer or queerness. And I work a lot, as everybody else in this conference, I love Sarah Ahmed. And I work a lot with her definition of queer, firstly as that which is oblique or offline or even just plain wonky, and secondly that which is those which are non-straight sexual practices as a form of social and sexual contact. So queerness here basically is not just strictly sexual acts and preferences, but refers to a kind of certain non-normative being in the world that involves various affective, political, social, and relational orientations, which Ahmed characterizes by ambiguity or wonkiness. So the way she puts it is that a straight body is a body which appears in line, whereas queer embodiment means being out of line. So queerness violates the constraints of heteronormativity. So the focus here is, as it is in many definitions of queerness, is on a kind of deviance from the straight line, from heterosexuality. And I want to preface that I think that's really important and I adhere to that a lot. However, I think it crucially overlooks one important aspect of queerness, what it means to be queer amongst other queer people, not necessarily in relation to straight people. We might tentatively call that a positive account, but I have some reservations about that. So the other thing I wanted to draw out is how joy is a super underrepresented affect in queer theory, in our activism, and a lot of the times in our culture, because the affective dimensions and relations of these spaces are enacting the shame, trauma, pain, and other negative affect, which originates from being in a homophobic society. Sedgwick has suggested that this comes maybe particularly from the trauma of the AIDS pandemic. And again, I want to preempt that I think this is super important and that negative affect should not or cannot be separated from queerness. Firstly, because it's historically, politically, and experientially still really relevant. But also because we often want to be kind of critical of the notion of happiness itself. So Sarah Ahmed, for example, in The Promise of Happiness, problematizes a pursuit of happiness, because happiness, where it's sanctioned by society, let's think about marriage, for example, is a kind of homonormative tool, which provides the emotional setting for this appointment. So the happy object there is a stable identity a lot of the time, and queerness is inherently not, and often actively rejects this kind of stability. Despite this, I think we've really neglected speaking about joy, and I want to give some space to joy today. And because I mostly work in phenomenology, I have a strong tendency to think about alterations of experience to bring out that which we usually take for granted. And so I'm going to start with a case of loss. So a couple of months ago, I was browsing through the news and I came across this guest column in The Guardian by the queer writer and journalist Benjamin Riley, in which he reflected on his experience of kind of a lack of queer community in the COVID-19 pandemic. And he writes, and that's the quote on the screen, "For many, queerness exists in those moments, not as an abstraction of identity, but as something enacted and shared between people in queer spaces. There are, of course, many ways to be queer, to do queer, but it is challenging for queerness to live wholly at the level of the abstract. How then can I find that feeling, those moments, those spaces, when it might still be months, years even, until their possibility returns in all that messy bodily queerness? In other words, what does it mean to say that I'm queer, sitting alone in my house during COVID?" I found that really striking, partly because it resonated with my own experience during the pandemic. My community really dispersed when lockdown hit, and I'm not very good at online spaces, so I missed out on that as an opportunity. And the philosophy in me was also tickled, because what he says here is that his subjective experience and kind of identity of queerness has been altered by the lack of those community spaces. And I think what he's hinting at here is that queerness is not something that exists prior to the intersubjective encounter, which is to say the encounter with other people, with other queer people, but that queerness is essentially enacted and shared between queer people. So what kind of intersubjective encounter is that? Riley associates his queerness with a messy bodily being, which I think is really common to queer theory, but I'm going to turn my attention to kind of a phenomenological perspective, because the body is central to phenomenology, particularly that of the French philosopher Maurice Merleau-Ponty, who writes that the body is our general means of having a world. So it's through the body that I can actually be in the world. We often speak of having a body, but overlook the fact that we also are a body. My body is not just a thing that can be perceived by others, that can be reflected upon by me, kind of like an object in the world, like the glass of water next to me, but it's a subjective living body. It's an experiencing body. All experience is lived through my body and inseparable from bodily being. And so specifically, Merleau-Ponty says that I am an agent who lives with a bodily orientation of openness towards others and the world and the possible actions and interactions in that world and with other people. He calls that a bodily I can. And as a result, he stresses that we encounter other people as similarly embodied beings. So for him, our intersubjectivity is fundamentally an intercorporeality. So our encounter with others is a kind of primordial bodily connectedness and intertwinement with the bodies of others. And really importantly, this intercorporeality underpins subjectivity and the possibility of a consciousness. So the world we're in is always already a shared world. And what I want to think about then is how, to return to Riley, who attributes a sort of constitutive power to queer intercorporeality in the sense that subjective queerness is lacking or diminished without it, that queer people embody queerness in a crucially intercorporeal way. So the idea is that in many ways, and I think that's kind of what I'm trying to work towards, is that an essential aspect of queer experience is actually realized in the encounter with other queer people, and it's felt as a loss when we don't have that. Yeah, and from this kind of account of queerness, I came to think about experiences of queer joy, and So I came across a Granta essay by Kevin Brazil. He's a writer and academic, and he's got, I think, a forthcoming book on queer happiness, where he also suggests that in the queer party scene, he finds moments and spaces where, and I quote, "my body and its difference were invited to belong." So this is specifically a feature of queer being amongst other queer people. So being together with other queers is kind of essential to queerness. It's also, I think, the place where queer joy does or can circulate. From kind of the discussion so far, we find that queer spaces, which are spaces of queer relationality and queer intercorporeality, are spaces of belonging. They're spaces where queer people can find a sort of joy in shamelessness, an embrace of the wonkiness and out-of-placeness of being queer. And we might say that rather than reorienting oneself to align with the straight ways, queer spaces offer the possibility to rejoice in the disorienting effects of Ahmed's queer moments. So yeah, I want to draw out that queerness involves a particular kind of openness towards other queer people, and so the lack of that queer space impacts our subjective experience of queerness. But very crucially, when we're thinking about joy, right, so basically where I'm arrived at now is that queer joy exists in queer space. But the nature of it is of a very particular kind. Brazil suggests that joy is not achieved by oneself, but can only happen if you expose yourself to others, if you kind of spread yourself into a network of connections. So this particular openness has nothing to do, this particular openness then is pointing us towards a kind of sharing of queer relations. In her later work, Eve Kosowski-Sedgwick emphasizes relations of holding as foundational to queerness. So she offers us a kind of permeable intersubjectivity, which is a sort of decentering of the subject, where the emphasis is instead on relationality and on the intertwinedness of the queer subject, as Bradway puts it. And that then produces this positive affect and these affective relations of holding and loving, produces a queer ethical relations, a mode of recognition wherein the self is successfully held in the other. This is also echoed in some of Judith Butler's work, where they write, queer relations are about finding value in being a porous boundary taken out of oneself, a field of ethical enmeshment with others, and a sense of disorientation for the first person. So the kind of takeaway for me here is that queer joy is nothing like the happiness that Ahmed criticizes, but a porous, permeable shifting into corporeal relations in queer intersubjective encounters. And indeed, Ahmed, despite her hesitancy to embrace happiness, features a notion of queer joy when she writes in the article Queer Orientations. The very act of describing queer gatherings as family gatherings is to have joy in the uncanny effect of a familiar form becoming strange. And then that led me to think about Audre Lorde's work, when in The Uses of the Erotic, she writes about joy as a shared joy, necessarily shared. She writes that the sharing of joy, whether physical, emotional, psychic, or intellectual, forms a bridge between the sharers, which can be the basis for understanding much of what is not shared between them, and lessens the threat of their difference. And I think she implies here a distinct queering of joy, in making space to share joy with those who are other, and locating joyfulness not in the future of any particular identity or group, not in a straight line or a stable identity, but rather using joy to open up a futurity in which people are valued in being other. Joy here becomes a sort of act of resistance, which is a wildly overused phrase, but actually comes out of the writings of Black feminist writers like her. And I think what we can find here is then the idea that rejoicing in deviance, in imagining queer utopias, shamelessly rejecting heteronormative and homonormative social rules, is a really queer undertaking. So I'm not sure how I'm doing on time, but to kind of finish off, I want to offer some reflections about the fact that I actually think joy is everywhere. But it's hard to detect, but precisely because there's nothing like the happiness that Ahmed criticizes. It's really complicated. It occurs side by side with suffering and pain and grief. And it's never claimed by one person. It's always shared and extended throughout others. And I think we've seen it throughout the conference, for example, yesterday with Emma Shepherd's talk on joy, a kind of joy that is not even seen as a possibility in an ableist society, or Ada M. Patterson's interpretation of the queer death drive as an incessant need for change, or earlier Dylan S.B.'s imaginary of a kind of joyous, non-binary futurity. Do cut me off if I'm going over, but my final thoughts go actually, I think, to the texts that have made me feel held with joy, and that's, I think, quite rare because a lot of literature in the queer space is really sad. One of them was Audre Lorde's biomythography, Sami, A New Spelling of My Name, which when I first read it, I bawled my eyes out. Not because it's a sad book at all, but because I'd never seen my own, despite the many differences in our lives between myself and Audre Lorde, but I'd never seen my own desire represented in such a way. And throughout her book, in the recollections of her being in Mexico, in being in bed with a lover from her work, and the tentative connections she forms when she regularly goes to a gay bar and then doesn't really talk to anyone there, it's full of joy. But it's not explicitly mentioned, it's just a part of her queer being. Similarly, I read The Argonauts by Maggie Nelson, which is a beautiful book that kind of combines autobiography with critical theoretical reflection. And she writes about messy family making and the coming together as queer of herself with her partner and their children and their queer being, while also having almost a kind of normative family unit. And one section that particularly stands out to me is when she and her partner go on a trip for her partner's top surgery. And she describes how they stay in a hotel room and cook over a hot plate to save money and intermittently empty the drains of bodily fluids. And it's pulsating joy. Again, in kind of the messiness of the sharedness of their life. And she contrasts actually the experience of unburdening euphoria and rebirth of her partner following top surgery with the grief and weeping of a woman that they see on television who's lost her breast due to a mastectomy. So again, I think that's an acknowledgement of the way in which joy is positioned in the queer world. Just a quick remark that I was thinking about earlier at the queer sex panel, which was so wonderful, but I think also part of me was missing some sort of, this happens again and again, I think, because it's so hidden, as sort of lesbian representation of sex. And one big thing in these two books, in both Audre Lorde's and Maggie Nelson's work, is how the erotic is interwoven with their everyday life. And again, that's, I think, a feature of queer joy. Right, to finish it up, a recent work, which is not an autobiography, by Legacy Russell, is the Glitch Feminist Manifesto, which is a really wonderful book. And it calls upon us, I think the queers and the feminists, to embrace the glitch, which is her kind of, I mean, I encourage you to read it, I really do. But the point here basically is that she thinks about the physical body as a kind of machine in the capitalist, homophobic, sexist, patriarchal, racist society, that we can, that as a machine can glitch and be in error, and that we should embrace that we find liberation in the bodies that cannot be read by others, and that we intentionally embody this glitch, the error message. And she writes about how bodies that travel through the glitch fail joyfully. And I'm going to end with a quote from the manifesto, because I think that's quite fitting, where she writes, "We fail to function for a machine that was not built for us. We refuse the rhetoric of inclusion and will not wait for this world to love us, to understand us, to make space for us. We will take up space and break this world, making new ones." Thank you.